When a currency devalues, this phenomenon is often considered a sign of economic problems in the country. And in some cases, it is. Because indeed, in many cases, devaluation is accompanied by economic problems in the country. This is especially true of uncontrolled devaluation. However, devaluation can also be a controlled phenomenon when the government, through the central bank, deliberately devalues its currency in order to strengthen the competitiveness of its own exports. And how all this happens, we will tell you in this video. Let's start with the fact that free-floating exchange rates, which are currently actively promoted by the IMF, are nothing more than a market regulator that should regulate trade between different countries, because theoretically, everything should happen as follows. When one country exports more than it imports, this means that the inflow of foreign currency into the country exceeds the outflow. And this, in turn, leads to the predominance of supply over demand, since there are more sellers of currency than buyers. And with freely floating exchange rates, this should lead to a strengthening of the national currency relative to the foreign one. And then this leads to a decrease in exports because they become more expensive. Let me explain with a real example. In one of the last videos, I talked about the strengthening of the Japanese yen against the dollar. And of course, this affected the cost of Japanese exports to the United States, because initially, a Toyota Corolla worth 1 million yen at an exchange rate of 250 yen to the dollar cost $4,000 in the United States. And when the exchange rate strengthened to 100 yen, 1 million yen had already turned into $10,000. That is, the price in Japanese yen did not change, but in American dollars it became more expensive. And of course, this led to a decrease in demand. However, there are also cases when the predominance of exports over imports does not lead to a strengthening of the national currency, but rather the opposite. And all because at the moment when exporters sell currency, the central bank enters the foreign exchange market and begins to actively buy currency, and thus balances the supply with its own demand. In general, this process, when the central bank buys currency on the interbank market, leads to an increase in international gold and foreign exchange reserves. It's just that in this case, the central bank, through this instrument of currency interventions, also tries to restrain the strengthening of the national currency in order to increase the competitiveness of exports. I will say even more. For some central banks, this is an element of systemic state policy, and some so clearly abuse this instrument that this, in turn, causes discontent in other countries and provokes currency wars. For example, China has been adhering to a policy of a weak yuan for many years, and they use the dollar reserves that were accumulated from currency interventions to further implement state policy. Also, a rather interesting point here is that the weakening of the yuan is a way to reduce the negative impact of the introduction of tariffs on Chinese goods. That is, the US raises tariffs to make Chinese imports more expensive, but China responds by devaluing the yuan, and the price of Chinese goods becomes lower. And while in the past the Americans could force the Japanese to strengthen the yen, now they have no tool to force China to strengthen the yuan.